Melissa Norris here. You're listening to the Dragging Alaska podcast, where David Bays and I sit down with candidates running for governor, Senate, and House to talk about one issue: trawl fishing in Alaska. It's one of the most talked about topics in this year's elections, and our goal is simple: help Alaskans understand where each candidate stands and what they plan to do about it. Just a reminder, if you appreciate this effort by David and I interviewing candidates on trawl, be sure to comment on these episodes, review and share them. And please do tag Dragging Alaska whenever you share. We are joined today by Meda DeWitt, who is running for Alaska governor. Meda will get us going with a little bit about herself and what inspired you to run for this campaign.
Great, thank you. So my English name is Meda DeWitt. My Tlingit names are Tsetsinak, and then my adult is Kak Duklaat, and then Jenmutla. And I am from Wrangell and Yakutat, but currently live on Dena'ina Ethnena with my partner and our children. I also, before I get into why I'm running for governor, I invited my campaign manager and my chief advisor, Chris Steer, to be with us. Chris, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, of course. So I'm Chris Steer. I've known Meda through my family for a long time. And as you mentioned, our families have been working together for generations. I'm Inupiaq from Unalakleet. My mother was actually born in Kotzebue, but she grew up in Unalakleet, speaking Inupiaq before she spoke English. She is a lawyer by training, and so she's been focused on Alaskan issues, indigenous issues for her entire life, really. And when Meda was looking for a campaign manager, I already knew what she was about. I knew how incredible she would be to the task, and I was very happy to sign up.
Well, thank you. AKA my hype man now. So I'm running because community has asked me to run, family has asked me to run, our elders and mentors have asked me to run, and I have a history of working with communities and community organizing and advocacy. My primary training is a traditional healer, and you can find a lot of work that I've done around traditional plants as food and medicine, or traditional foods as the best foods for healthy human beings. I work within the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and I've worked with community health aides and behavioral health aides and different groups training on these topics for decades. And when you are in traditional healing, one of the processes is learning how to address things in a systems thinking capacity, not a symptoms capacity. And so the thinking of system structures then leads you pretty quick into law and policy, because you have laws that actually obstruct people eating the best food in the world for them that they've lived with and have access to. We have also other laws and policies that are in place that diminish the abundance that we have in our state, or the health of our lands and our waterways. So pretty early on, I got into advocating for changes in laws and policies around those things that matter to Alaskans. And one of the things I'm known for is in the political realm is the Recall Dunleavy movement. I led that in 2018, one of the largest grassroots political movements in the state. And since then, people have asked, like I said, for me to run every year for any office that I want. One of the things is we have children, 8 total, 5 still at home, and I don't want to be in DC. Juneau is close enough that we can make it work, and kids, with kids and family and sports and school and everything. And that's really why I'm doing this, because of my children, because of your children, because of our future. What we're looking at right now is significant impacts by extreme weather events through climate change. We also have extractive industries that are contaminating lands or over harvesting our fish, such as the big trawlers and industrial trawlers. And we have other impacts such as food insecurity. And that doesn't make sense. We have 20% of the United States land mass. We have some of the most beautiful, pristine lands in the world. There's no reason why we should be facing food insecurity in Alaska. And I've actually worked with David a little bit, and also Heather Gordon, on reviewing fish policy to then align my platforms with best practices and what can a governor do. Because a lot of times people will say, oh, that's at the congressional level, that will take an act to change it. But there's actually a lot of things that the governor can do in this process. You can appoint the commissioner of, ADF&G and have somebody who actually is a fish scientist and who understands science and data. You have 6 Board of Fish positions that you can appoint and through your intervals. And then there's the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which the governor gets to appoint people. And then from there, there's advocating for descriptions and management for the type of trawling and really registering them for what do they do? Are they mid-level or do they actually touch the bottom? Because those are so outdated. A lot of our gear regs for trawling industries are back into the 70s and they're significantly outdated. So I'm going to pause there because I could keep going on about food sustainability and climate change and economic diversification and so forth. But I'm going to hand it to you to, I guess, pose the first question.
Well, actually, we do want you to go on about those subjects.
Okay.
They are very important. They're tied in, and they haven't been addressed so in depth by the other candidates. And so, if that's sort of your strength and what you bring to the table, and look at it from a well-rounded point of view like that, I think that's really special. David, do you see otherwise?
Well, no, I totally agree. And that was gonna be my first question, was how like food security and traditional foods and trawl all interlink, or how you see that, or how your history in dealing with those kind of comes to a head now or as governor.
Okay. Well, thank you. You ready for story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the beautiful things that being an independent, undeclared candidate is I do not have to toe the line with party rhetoric. I have the same affiliation as over 60% of Alaskans. And we know that most Alaskans feel very strongly about our fish and game and our natural areas and living the Alaskan way of life. And I guess what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go way back and talk about this historical. Chris mentioned earlier that our families have been working together for generations. So his mother's Victoria Hike Steer. She was mentored by Etuk. Etuk was mentored by William Paul, and so forth. And so William Paul is an Alaska Native lawyer who was the first Alaska Native legislator in the state. And him and his brother, Louis Paul, and their mother, Tilly Paul Tamery, actually helped to start the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood. William also represented my grandfather and my great-great-grandfather on my other side, Chief Shakes Charlie Jones, to win the right for Alaska Native people to vote in 1924. And so that has, like we're saying, we're having decades and generations of family who have worked for Alaskans and our Alaskan way of life. So Tilly Paul Tamery was Teton. She was a very high caste woman, and she actually became one of the first Alaska Native missionaries in the state. And her family, if you don't know about Tlinkits, we have a range that we guard, we protect, we steward. That's our function as guardians and stewards of the land and the plants and animals within that space. So her traditional territories, part of it is in Salmon Bay. And she had a house that was there, and the U.S. government was working with the canneries, and they wanted Salmon Bay and they wanted the river because it was so abundant. My grandmother talks about her grandparents talking about how there's so many fish in the river that you could like walk across it and not get wet. And of course, I'm like, well, that must be, more of like an analogy because they're so slimy, you'd fall in anyways. But that's how full they were, right? They're just boiling and beautiful. And these pictures of these salmon are huge. They're just absolutely ginormous. And the stories that came with that are the stories of intentional care of the salmon streams. asking at people if we were going to migrate somewhere, we would send people ahead of the community's migration to go seed the streams with salmon stock so that there was plenty of abundance for when the larger group of people got there. We have the traditional stories of the fog woman, which if you ever want to hear more about, you can talk to Tom Harris. He's a beautiful ambassador of that story. But we have special baskets that we would collect the milk and the eggs from the salmon. We would, and of course the largest ones, and genetic diversity, not just one, but a bunch of them. And we would put them in special baskets up at the headwaters in the spawning areas. There has to be a little bit of a waterfall so that it has that fresh water turning the eggs and nutrients. And then they hatch and they refill the river and they come back with an abundance. So this area, it was highly coveted by the canning industry. And like I said, the US government, they worked with them. They burned down Tilly Paul's house because they wanted to have access. And the community came back and they rebuilt her house and they burned it down again. And they said, if you rebuild it, we will burn it a third time with you in it. And so they, my great-great-grandfather ended up building her 10-bedroom, beautiful house in Wrangell where she would care for people. She spent her whole life in service to people and caring, and as a lay nurse and a missionary, and also educating people across Southeast Alaska and advocating for people as well. So later on, William Paul and Louis Paul, after they had already gone to law school, they had already started working on Alaska Native Claims Settlement. He's actually considered the grandfather of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And they went and fished in Salmon Bay as Teton men. That was their traditional area to fish. They had the right to be there and the right to be fishing, but they were arrested for doing so. And they, were proudly defiant in protecting themselves and advocating for the ability to continue to fish. Some people may know or may not know, one of the reasons why William Paul was kind of eventually blacklisted was because in an ANCSA, there's this language that is the erasure or ending Aboriginal rights and title to land and water. It extinguishes it. And he vehemently fought against that. And he said, that will cause us issues in time perpetuity if we allow that to go forward. And we're seeing those kinds of issues now and how they're playing out. So that's some of my family history with relationship. And then my other part of my father was a commercial fisherman and traditional subsistence fisherman. My grandfather was also a traditional and commercial halibut fisherman. And so I was raised on our traditional foods. I was born in Kloak. Actually, I grew up in Hollis, but I was born in Alicia Roberts' house next to Totem Park. And she was the community health aide there. And so I didn't know we were poor because we had food. We had everything we needed. We didn't have running water. We had to haul our water. And so we canned and jarred all of our salmon, halibut, deer meat, vegetables, berries, all of it, greens, our beach greens like goose tongue, or beach asparagus. And so I had a very rich diet of traditional foods. And I believe, that's part of how I stayed so healthy as a child, was having access to that real food. And I believe that all of our families should have access to real food. And so that experience really does inform a lot of what I believe is best for us moving forward, is not only the lived history and family, but also listening to our communities, right? So digging in for governor, I was actually quite surprised. We all read the state constitution in high school at some point, but it's not like anybody memorized it, especially not 20 years later. But I went through it again with fresh eyes, and I was like, holy shnikes, we actually got one of the best constitutions in the United States. Title VIII, we have to manage sustained yield so that we have a healthy environment so Alaskans can live the Alaskan way of life into time and perpetuity. And so that is a mandate. It's not if you feel like it. It's not if somebody paid you off enough. It's a mandate that exists within that space. And then if you pair that actually with the NILCA, which is a law that came in after INCSA, Title 8 of ANILCA, funny, they're both Title 8. I don't think anybody planned that, but it has a rural preference for subsistence. So it defines what subsistence is, and then it has a rural preference. And the rural preference is regardless of your ethnicity, because when you're out in rural communities, you have all this beautiful food available to you, and receiving food from other places, not only does it not make any sense, but by the time it gets to you, it's reduced in its nutritional value because it's so long after harvest. It's also incredibly, incredibly expensive, and it's scarce. If you don't have the barge that comes in or the plane that comes in or whatever, then you don't have access to it. So it's a fundamental action to make sure that we have subsistence that's available for rural communities. It's managed in a way that Alaskans have access, and not only now, but in the future. And I can tell you that the people who have been in political office have failed us. They have failed at this. We have salmon that are not coming back in the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers. We have salmon who aren't showing up, in enough abundance here in South Central for people to harvest. And there are ways to address this. It's not like a finite resource that you use until it disappears. It's one that if we actually use evidence-based practice, best science, data, and traditional values, we can actually rebuild our salmon stock, and we can rebuild our herring stock, and we can rebuild a lot of these other foundational core foods that we depend on within the state. I love Alaskans, but we have a little bit of hubris. We're a little full of ourselves sometimes. And one of those things is that we believe that we're completely self-sufficient. We believe that we don't really need anybody else, and that we can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. I do agree that we can pull ourselves up as a community together, but the part that needs to be like a little bit of a reality check that we need to address is that we actually ship in 95% of our food and goods and medicines outside of the state. The majority of that comes in to the port of Anchorage on Tuesday and Sunday on the big ships. And if we miss one of those, you will see immediately in 3 days, we start running low on those core items in the stores: milk, eggs, bread, diapers, formula, all that kind of stuff. So it would not take a lot. If both of the ships quit running, it would be 3 days before we started seeing shortages, and it would be 7 days before we were out of food and goods in the stores. That is not self-sufficient. And it's definitely not self-sufficient in the situation that we're in now globally, where we have war that's happening that's, cutting off major travel and shipping lanes. It's not for our best good. And so my priority, one of them, along with addressing the massive industrial trawlers and bycatch, is also investing in agriculture in the state, investing in stewardship in our state. And what does that look like? Well, first of all, there is money. People say, where do you get the money? Stop subsidizing oil and gas industries. And not only are we not taking the taxes we need, but we're giving them money. So that's enough. We don't need to be giving billionaires corporate welfare. Our state deserves it. That's an agreement under the permanent fund that the citizens of Alaska have rights to royalties and taxes for the extraction of the minerals and oil and gas that are here. So standing up for that, bringing in that funds, and then it's not going to take a lot of money to then invest into our food systems. We have the Food Policy Council. We have farmers and ranchers and gardeners and people they've been working very hard to be here and to make it work without major support. So if we even just give them modest support, then you can see a flourishing of those foods, which then can be provided to communities or even into our school system. Wouldn't it be great to have our kids across the state eating whole, rich foods that were grown here with the highest nutrients available to them? And we can also mandate that we can't use glyphosates, so we're not poisoning each other and our children. I mean, this is common sense stuff that could be done very easily. So, like I said, supporting agriculture, getting the best foods possible into our schools. It's also not going to cost a lot of money to do universal free lunch and free breakfast for our kids. It's microscopic. And the amount of money that we will save in health issues down the line, it's going to more than double and triple pay for itself. It's a no-brainer. Beyond that, we could also have kids growing foods in the schools. So part of our traditional culture, whether you're Alaska Native and even non-Native people, right? Our kids get their first fish, and what do? They give it to the family or to the elders. Kids get their first moose. It's a distribution to the family and the community. That's very significant because it creates core networks and social stability that become positive coping mechanisms. Right now, our state, we have some of the highest domestic violence. We have substance abuse, sexual assault, suicides. We have an epidemic of violence and crime in our state. And there's different ways to address that. One is having adequate police and safety, of course. You know, the last administration pulled VPSOs out of the community. I think that the last administration for our last governor actually, I won't go there, but I think that he was intentionally causing harm in some places. So if we have adequate safety, if we have food security, and you give children ways to create industry and to share and strengthen their community, then it will create that self-sufficiency for real. It'll create self-pride and confidence. And it then starts that system of sharing, the economics of sharing once again, which is a traditional economic structure that's still alive in rural Alaska. You know, like I have this one interview I did for our talk, the Regional Tribal Operations Committee. I was working with them. And in the video, we have a fish scientist talking about how even if you have a family that fishes a lot, they will have families, fish from 5 different families in their freezer or jarred. So why? Because I'm going to share my fish with you. You're going to share some with me, or I might share jelly with you, right? So you have this exchange, and there's a diversification of nutrients, a diversification of types of food, and even like the types of salmon, they're going to have different profiles. And so by sharing and exchanging, you're going to then diversify the profile of nutrients in the salmon that you get as well. And other people have different recipes, right? It's so yummy to have somebody else's salmon that they made a different way than you have. And so that's in the schools. And another part of this like overlapping policy, and I think that's one of the challenges I've been working on, is because I'm a holistic systems thinker, and everybody wants these like 30-second sound bites on a platform. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way. You know, there's no single bullet that's going to save our economy. There's no single bullet that's going to save our food system or reduce crime. There's multiple systems that are dynamic and woven and holistic. And so once we start thinking in that way, we can create a system of abundance that is care is always more affordable than crisis management. Prevention is always more affordable than crisis management. And so in that thinking, if we have on the land guardians that are actively stewarding the lands, we could just take one example. So if you have people who are an on the land guardian and they're walking the lands during the walkabouts in the winter, or the snow machine abouts or dog sled abouts, whatever, and they're doing intentional traditional burning of spruce beetle kill or other, like things, just there's a lot of storm damage, there's spruce beetles, there's trees that are not surviving because climate change, it's too warm for them. The black spruce are being under attack because of the heat. If you burn those in the summer, then you reduce the wildfire fodder, and you burn them in the winter, you reduce the wildfire capacity in the summer. So Alaska spends over $70,000 a year fighting wildfires. Not 70,000. Please cut that out. Alaska spends $70 million a year fighting wildfires. So if you have intentional traditional burning in the winter, then you're actually going to save enough money in the summer that the program pays for itself. And, those wildfires actually affect our salmon streams as well, because the wildfire doesn't stop at the edge of the stream to make sure that there's a tree buffer, right, for ecological purposes. It's going to go all the way down to the stream and across the stream. It's going to burn out all of that vital nutrition. And also, then you have erosion occurrences that happen. And there's significant heating of the rivers when there's wildfires around them, which then will destroy juvenile salmon or eggs or things that are very sensitive. So we see this as this multifaceted, layered approach to caring for Alaska and Alaskans. You can have these on the land guardians teaching and the kids in the school how to hunt, fish, process, gather, and preserve. And when you're doing that, then traditional ecological knowledge is passed on to the kids. And this is kind of funny because some people, their brain, like when I'm saying this, they're thinking only Alaska Native people teaching only Alaska Native kids. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about teaching all of our children the story and history and joy and relationship and creating that richness of why it's so wonderful to be an Alaskan and in their region and in their community that they're in. Rebuilding that sense of pride in them is so important. So those are a few layered things. When we get down to some of the other nitty gritty items, like I said earlier, management of those massive industrial trawlers is so important. And I keep saying that with a caveat, like outside, massive, because honestly, I'm going to say we've spoken to some of the smaller CDQs, and I'm kind of annoyed because the industry, you've got these big giants over here that are taking out 74% plus of the money that they're making. They're taking the fish out of the state, they're getting processed out of the state, and they're taking most of the money out of the state. They're sending these little CDQs that are in state as the ambassadors for the trawling industry. And it's not adequate and it's not correct. So you have the smaller groups that are more intentional. They've got great numbers. They actually care about bycatch. And they're like the sole economic driver for a rural community on the Aleutians. We should not be going after those folks. We should help them to support them so that they can have the best ethical standards that they want because they care too. It's their state. But then there's, like I said, these other actors that do not care about Alaskans at all.
How in the world would you delineate between those two types of fishermen at a regulatory level? I mean, not that you're handing down the regulations, but you're certainly going to champion for them and choose the people, right?
Yeah, of course. And what does that do? That means that you have to have an intentional system. So by putting, like I said, local people who have knowledge of the industry, not my best friend, not somebody's cousin that I owe a favor to. That's ridiculous. The nepotism in our state's been wild. You put the people who know the science, who know the community, who are Alaskans into those board seats. And they will be able to make decisions and delineate between those groups because it's actually not that hard. And if anybody says it is, then they're just trying to put up a smoke rouge.
How much feedback have you had from voters like asking specifically about trawl? Does that come up frequently if you like have a rally or a speech or an interaction?
No, I think like people want to talk about it with me, but they don't have to bring it up because it's already on my website. I've already worked to create policy and be very open about it. I met with a small CDQ leader to adjust some of my language so that it's not so attacking to the local folks, but very strong stance on these other facets of industry. And I add it into my conversation already. You don't have to pry to find these kinds of things. You'll find that some of our gubernatorial candidates have already received money from trawling. They've already been coerced in some way. And so it's going to be intentional to have a good differentiation. Also, there's a couple of candidates who see how popular trawl is, and they've like literally gone off the deep end on it. Good for them. But I think that we have to have a very intentional, managed approach that is weighed with wisdom and balance and science and community, and have a conversation that brings everybody to the table, regardless of party politics, and really figure out something that serves everybody. Not everybody will get all of what they want. That's not what compromise is. But we can bring this excessive bycatch into a much different realm, because right now what is happening is killing our sea floor. So it's not only killing salmon habitat, pollock habitat, herring habitat, it's also killing habitat for king salmon and for seals and for every other ocean going animal that we care about. We literally have massive dead zones that are out in the ocean. And so not only do we need to reduce that destruction, we have to talk about how do we repair it in a really rapid order. Because if we start increasing the amount of salmon because of that destruction, there might not be enough nutrients to support them out there. So it has to be in the rivers and in the ocean. And like I said, reducing excess bycatch, bringing it into a manageable level that Alaskans are okay with, and hopefully zero if we do a good job. And then restoration of habitat. Chris, what am I missing?
No, that was good. One of the things that we talked about, we've been talking about is getting more research, getting more scientists, getting people, checking out the bottoms of the ocean, seeing where the destruction is, possibility of fostering natural restoration of habitat, perhaps even adding some artificial habitat, and whatever we can do to follow the health of the fish throughout their life cycle, so we're giving them the best opportunity to flourish and achieve that abundance that we're all dependent on.
I think a headwind that you're going to run into is this kind of accusation that it's already happened already. So like with CDQ groups specifically, like for instance, BBEDC and Arctic Storm Management just bought like this $100 million factory trawler together. And so there we see this kind of weird integration. And I don't think they're the only ones that have done it, of like big outside Seattle factory trawl. But when they come to a meeting, they say, hey, we're BBEDC. You should love us. We're Alaska. We're pumping money into this. But then when you start to dig into infrastructure and like ownership schedules, you see this big Seattle ownership there. And so what we've actually seen with Dunleavy lately is that a lot of his picks to the NPFMC have been members of CDQ groups. But when you start to look again at corporate structure, what the CDQ groups locally own is also what the Seattle boats own. And so that's kind of how we've seen the votes go, is still, even though it's CDQ people, even though they're from Alaska, we're still seeing them kind of support trawl as a whole. So not to insinuate there's a 5-second answer to that, but I just think it's something that you or any governor is going to run into with that balance.
Yeah. And that's, having a good metrics of who's on those boards is going to be important, because if you have the fox guarding the hen house, you're never going to have eggs. So that is an intentional, bringing in fish scientists and people who have a good understanding of the differentiation. And that's where we're going to catch some of that stuff, is, making sure that we change or advocate for change of those regulations. So that way the netting and the boats are actually labeled and listed for what they are doing, how much they're actually touching the seafloor, not just as the topical, shellac.
Melissa, you're about to ask a question.
No, I'm trying to wrap my head around the CDQ, because I've personally witnessed the head of a CDQ group come in on a Salmon State, rally and try to comment during and hire aggressive PR for representatives. It's going to be hard to convince me that we need to protect that, personally.
Well, and what's the level of protection? What we're talking about protecting is being authentic and honest in the fact that our state has very few economic capacities at this point in time. And there's several communities, specifically 13 Aleutian communities, that's their only income. And so if we come in too heavy-handed without at least taking the time to understand what people are dealing with, then we'll be attacking our own people. Now, there is the ruse, right? They're using them as a front in some cases, and that's fine. But we see that in every major industry. Oil and gas. That is our dominant primary economic driver in the state, and it is not sustainable. We have to transition and diversify our economies. And so that's going to take work. It's going to take collaboration and coalitions to be able to do that, and having honest conversations of what do people really need. Now, up in Barrow, their economy is 100% dependent on oil and gas. So anybody coming in and just ending it immediately or trying to is not living in reality, is not serving Alaskans. And so it's going to take that hard work to be able to hold both realities and experiences and existences, and to create a space where we can then shift, and people can let down their guard, and we can work together and find out what is the vision that we actually want to create for the future.
Well, we do kind of a couple standardized questions on each one of these interviews. One of them is if you are willing to take money from trawl, or if you'd be willing to commit that you would give it back. And then the other is if, when you were governor, if you found out down the road that the policies that you had created or you had supported, like, for instance, if you said that midwater trawls couldn't be on bottom, and that functionally 5 years from now meant that midwater or the pollock fleet couldn't fish anymore, if you would be okay with that ramification of making the decision, or if essentially if trawl came back to you and said, hey, this is going to put us out of business, if you would be okay sticking to your guns, or if you feel like that would bend you to change your mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good questions. No, I do not want trawling money. Do not give it to me. And if we figure out we have it, we will give it back.
Yeah.
Yeah. If somebody sees it, like there's somebody that I don't know that's donated trawl money, and I didn't realize that they were, because, our corporate laws are with donations have changed. There's zero corporate funding that can be donated. It has to all be done by individuals. So what we're seeing is individuals who are leaders in the trawling industry who are giving money to the campaigns. So we don't want it. And as far as regulations, I do appreciate the binary process of like, if this, but I believe that we can actually create better regulations that's not going to end the industry. And so that's where I'm committing to, is doing the actual work to find a way that we can still support this industry, especially if it's Alaskan owned and Alaskan based, but then bring in the correct kind of gear and laws and policies and technology that are needed to make sure that we're not destroying our home and our future. If I were to continue on to talk, I think a good segue is to talk about climate change. There are some candidates who are not willing to speak about it. And it's this kind of this weird issue that's being used when it's convenient. So you'll have these big trawlers say that climate change is the reason that there's no fish. And they'll point to like one heat event that happened 1 year and then say that that's the whole reason. And that's not adequate or correct. With that being said, we are dealing with climate change, and our fish are actually incredibly resilient. They're already moving up northwards in the river systems up the coast of Alaska and the Bering Sea. And what we've seen with data and gosh, what is it? Chile has Alaskan king salmon that are running in their streams. New Zealand have Alaska king salmon running in some of their streams. They were seeded there, and they're coming back, and they're thriving, and they're healthy, and they're beautiful, and they're much warmer climates than we are. So it's about having a very clear-eyed vision of what we need to do. And like I said, we have the habitat restoration that we need to focus on. We need to upgrade all of our laws and policies on regs. We need to have people who are in those board seats who understand the issues and who aren't getting paid off or, secretly working for somebody else or themselves. And we need to go into habitat restoration, not only in the rivers, but on land, and be aware that Alaska's climate is changing 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the United States. Our families, mine being Tlingit and his being a Nutpak, we have stories. We have stories about when climate has changed before and the collapses that were experienced, the starvation and sickness and health issues and environmental issues that have happened before. And so what we're dealing with now is climate change, but it's in a much more rapid situation because of what humans have done in increasing carbon to over 400 parts per million for the air. And in our state, we actually have permafrost that's classified as Yedema. Yedema permafrost is mostly water, and it has incredibly high components of methane. So if the Yedema collapses and it starts to melt, it's going to release significant amounts of methane, which is much more impactful in increasing the temperature with greenhouse gases than carbon is. So we basically have a methane bomb up in the North Slope that's going to be happening, that's going to expedite the heating of our natural spaces and our average temperatures, at least in the northern hemisphere. So we can proactively be ready for these things. There is an unmet needs report that was done by the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and we have communities that have to move. They're either going to have to completely relocate, or they're going to have a systematic, retreat from where they're at to similar location, but just further away, a managed retreat. And if we spend a lot of money now, roughly $6 billion now, and it's going to save us $24 billion if we just do crisis management and response. So that is something that Alaskans need to be aware of. And if we are doing the things necessary, we can not only transition through these climate changes and disruptions, we're going to have extreme weather events, we're going to have disruptions, our seasons are going to become chaotic. We have to actively work to support our fish and our people and our game and our lands so that way we can transition well and not only just survive, but thrive in the coming future.
Yeah, and something I thought of that I wanted to add to that is that the land, the water, these are sacred things and they're the highest importance to us. And at the same time, we are not necessarily trying to shut down all the mines. We're not trying to shut down oil and gas completely. We are trying to build our energy sector and make sure we are taking our fair share of the revenue from those sectors so that we can transition to a clean and renewable energy system that will last in perpetuity, unlike the oil and gas that's going to run out inevitably, and get us, so that we can make sure we're not just have the renewable energy, but the well-paying jobs of people in the, for people in the community working locally and taking care of our state.
I'd love to, just be hardcore on every single issue and only one way or it's the highway, but that's not being in service to Alaskans. And it's much harder, I think, to create space for people to speak even when they're not directly aligned with you. And that's something I've done for very many years for my career, is created that space for people with opposing views and experiences and desires to be able to work together. And I want to put that to service for our communities in our state.
Thank you, Meda. Well, that wraps up this episode of Dragging Alaska. We created this podcast as a public service effort to help keep our fisheries and resource conversations front and center. If you found value in today's episode, please follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with others who care about Alaska's future. Your comments, feedback, and support help us continue these conversations and reach many more people across the state. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Dragging Alaska.